March 1943. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, beneath gray seas and darker skies, a German submarine cuts through the water with the confidence of an apex predator. It is a U-boat at the height of its dominion, a steel wolf with a kill count mounting by the week. The men aboard feel it too. They have hunted American convoys across hundreds of miles of ocean, sinking merchant vessels laden with supplies destined for a Britain growing thinner by the day. They are winning. They know they are winning. And they have every reason to believe that victory in this underwater war is not a distant dream, but an approaching certainty. But ask any survivor of the Atlantic campaign what changed in the span of mere weeks. Ask them about that shift from hunter to hunted, and you will hear stories not of defeat delivered through naval gunfire or the clash of surface fleets, but of something far more terrifying, the sudden realization that they were no longer invisible. They had become prey to an enemy they could neither see nor effectively counter. What happened in the Atlantic between March and May 1943 represents one of the most dramatic reversals in naval history, and it was engineered not by battleships or traditional submarines, but by an improvised weapon born from American ingenuity and industrial abundance, the escort carrier and the pilots who flew from her wooden decks. This is the story of how technology, courage, and relentless American production capacity turned the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic overnight, transforming an underwater threat into an underwater graveyard. To understand the magnitude of what the Germans achieved before their sudden collapse, one must grasp just how perilous the Atlantic had become for the Allies. By March 1943, the U-boat arm under Grand Admiral Karl Donitz had reached its operational apex. The statistics were brutal and unforgiving. In March alone, German submarines sank 120 merchant ships, roughly one vessel every 4 hours. Over 693,000 tons of Allied shipping went to the bottom, with 476,000 tons lost in the Atlantic itself. The official Royal Navy historian, Stephen Roskill, would later conclude that the Germans never came so near to disrupting communications between the New World and the Old as in the first 20 days of March 1943. The U-boat threat was not merely a naval problem, it was an existential one. Every ship sunk represented supplies that would not reach Britain. Every ton of cargo lost was a ton of ammunition, food, fuel, and war material that could not be transformed into the machinery of war. The United States and Britain were, in a very real sense, being slowly strangled. The Atlantic had become what Allied strategists called the Black Pit, a mid-ocean region roughly between Greenland and Iceland where Allied land-based aircraft could not reach. In this void, the U-boats operated with near impunity. Donitz commanded a force that appeared unstoppable. He had somewhere in the region of 240 operational U-boats, with 118 operating at sea at any given moment. Every month, German shipyards were producing 20 to 24 new boats, a production rate that seemed to ensure an endless supply of predators. The wolf packs hunted in coordinated formations, surrounding convoys and attacking in waves, often with 10 to 15 submarines coordinating their assaults. When a convoy was located, the mathematics of the slaughter were grimly inevitable. Surface escorts were limited in number, depth charges were expensive and not always effective, and the vast expanse of ocean meant that many wolf packs could operate simultaneously on different convoy routes. For months, the Germans had possessed an overwhelming advantage. Yet beneath this facade of invulnerability, the Germans faced a problem they did not fully understand: they were being blinded by science. In early February 1943, German naval officers examining a captured British radar set made a discovery that fundamentally altered their understanding of the war at sea. The sophisticated centimetric radar technology encoded in that captured device explained everything that had mystified them for months. The impossible Allied air attacks during darkness. The convoys that seemed to evade them with prescient knowledge of their positions. The aircraft that appeared on the horizon with uncanny precision. Donitz's staff realized, in that moment of technical revelation, that they had been fighting an invisible war against an unseen enemy. One of Donitz's senior officers later confessed to interrogators, "We have been fighting blind." The Allies, meanwhile, possessed not merely superior radar technology, but something arguably more powerful: they possessed overwhelming material abundance. The British, in conjunction with American industrial capacity, had produced the Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo, codenamed Fido, which entered service in March 1943. This was not a traditional torpedo that required a pilot to calculate impact, but rather an intelligent weapon that could listen for the sound of a submarine's propellers and home in on them autonomously. It represented a quantum leap in anti-submarine warfare capability. But the most critical adaptation, the one that would ultimately break the U-boat campaign, came in the form of the escort carrier, or CVE. These were converted merchant vessels, hastily transformed into light carriers that carried a composite squadron of fighters and torpedo bombers. They were small, barely a third the displacement of the great fleet carriers. They were slow. They were fragile. By any rational assessment of naval architecture, they should not have worked. And yet they became the instruments of the U-boat arms destruction. The transformation of March into May 1943 reveals the profound psychological and technological gap that separated German and American forces at this critical moment. Consider what a German U-boat commander expected as he began a patrol in early 1943. He anticipated a familiar tactical environment, surface attacks against merchant convoys, with occasional encounters with escort vessels that could be evaded through diving. He was trained to expect that as long as his boat remained submerged, it was relatively safe. Depth charges were annoying and dangerous if you were caught unaware, but they were not the ultimate threat. The sea itself offered refuge and concealment. What he actually encountered, within weeks, was fundamentally different. On March 1943, U-boats began reporting a phenomenon they could not adequately explain. Aircraft appeared over them in conditions where aircraft should not be able to operate. Night attacks became increasingly common as the Allies deployed radar-equipped aircraft that could detect a surface submarine from 20 miles away, beyond the range of human eyesight. The U-boat's radio warning receivers, which were supposed to provide warning of incoming aircraft, proved unreliable against these new centimetric frequencies. Commanders who had surfaced to recharge batteries, relying on their radar warning systems to provide early alert, found themselves under attack with no warning whatsoever. Consider the experience of Capitan Hans Johansen commanding U-569. On May 22, 1943, he surfaced in the North Atlantic to transmit radio signals, believing his radar warning receivers would alert him to any approaching aircraft. Instead, the first indication he had of danger came when a TBF Avenger piloted by Lieutenant William Chamberlain of the USS Bogue's VC-9 squadron dropped from the clouds. Chamberlain's depth bombs exploded alongside the boat, causing immediate damage. As U-569 attempted to dive for safety, the traditional response to air attack, Johansen discovered that water was pouring in through the stern. He had no choice but to surface again. Another Avenger, piloted by Lieutenant H.S. Roberts, roared in for a second pass, delivering another pattern of depth bombs. The boat's structural integrity was failing. Johansen gave the order to abandon ship. As his men emerged onto the casing to prepare for evacuation, Gunner W.C. Boyd opened fire with his .50 caliber machine guns, raking the conning tower to prevent the Germans from manning their anti-aircraft guns. 21 men went down with the boat or drowned in the chaos. U-569 had lasted less than 2 hours after the first attack. This was not an aberration. It was a preview of what would become systematic slaughter. The USS Bogue, under the command of Captain Giles E. Short, became the first escort carrier to achieve confirmed kills against U-boats. Between May 22 and the end of the month, Bogue's aircraft would sink 3 U-boats. But the real turning point came when the USS Core and USS Card entered the Atlantic hunting killer operations in July 1943. The Card, under Captain Arnold J. Isbell, a man his crews called Buster Isbell for his aggressive tactics, would become the deadliest escort carrier of the war, with 11 confirmed U-boat kills to her credit. What distinguished these escort carrier operations from earlier attempts at anti-submarine warfare was not merely technology, but the integration of multiple technological systems working in concert. Cryptanalysts had repenetrated the German Enigma codes, meaning that American commanders received signals intelligence about U-boat positions and rendezvous points. This intelligence was fed to the escort carrier task forces, directing them to specific coordinates where U-boats would be operating. Once directed to a general search area, the carrier's radar operators could detect surfaced submarines. Pilots and Wildcats and Avengers could then close for the attack. And once a U-boat was forced to dive, the acoustic homing torpedoes, the phytoweapons, could pursue them beneath the waves. The psychological impact on German submariners was devastating. Kriegsmarine officers who survived capture and were interrogated later provided testimony that revealed the profound shift in morale. One captain, interrogated at Fort Hunt, Virginia, confessed to his American interrogators, "We knew by mid-1943 that the war was lost." This was not the reflection of a defeatist, this was a highly trained professional who understood exactly what had happened. He was not defeated by conventional warfare. He had been rendered obsolete by science. His boat was visible to enemies he could not see. His radar warning systems, which were supposed to provide protection, had become worse than useless. They provided false confidence before catastrophe. Staying submerged meant staying safe, but eventually batteries ran down and the boat had to surface. Surfacing meant almost certain detection and destruction. The transformation was complete by May 1943. Where German commanders had expected to hunt, they discovered they were being hunted. May became known in German naval circles as Black May, a month in which 41 U-boats were destroyed, representing fully 25% of the operational submarine force. The month opened with the battle for convoy ONS-5, costly for both sides but ultimately won by Allied escort forces who were learning to coordinate their tactics with ruthless efficiency. 5 U-boats were sunk attacking convoy SC-130 without sinking a single merchant vessel in return. The impact on German naval strategy was immediate and decisive. On May 24, 1943, just days after the blackest month of losses ended, Dönitz issued a shocking order to his fleet. The vast majority of U-boats were to withdraw from the North Atlantic. The offensive was suspended. The admiral who had promised his Führer victory in the Atlantic, who had boasted of starving Britain into submission, who had filled his submariners with the ideology of inevitable triumph, was forced to acknowledge that the battle had been lost. Dönitz's order came with bitter language that revealed the scope of his defeat. He spoke of technological inferiority that could not be overcome. He acknowledged that Allied air cover had become complete and that U-boats could no longer conduct operations in convoy areas with any hope of success. For the first time, the German Naval Command officially admitted that the U-boat campaign in its original conception had failed. What makes this reversal so remarkable is not merely that it occurred, but that it occurred while the Germans still possessed enormous numerical strength. In May 1943, Dönitz had more U-boats in commission than at any point in the war. The problem was not quantity, it was the sudden revelation that quantity meant nothing against qualitatively superior technology and tactics. The Allies were not winning the Battle of the Atlantic through numerical superiority. American escort carriers were individually slower and less powerful than fleet carriers. Rather, they were winning through integration, combining radar, cryptanalysis, acoustic homing weapons, effective surface escorts, and coordinated air tactics into a system where the U-boat had no answer. This integration depended fundamentally on American abundance. The United States produced 122 escort carriers during the war, the vast majority of all aircraft carriers built by American industry. 50 of these alone were Casablanca-class carriers, mass-produced with a standardization and efficiency that reflected American manufacturing power. These ships could be built, equipped, and sent to sea faster than German industry could replace submarine losses. The aircraft that flew from their decks, the Wildcats and Avengers, were produced in the tens of thousands. When one was shot down, another was ready to take its place. When one escort carrier was damaged, there were others. Consider the symbolic representation of this abundance through a mundane but essential element of shipboard life: food. A German U-boat, operating in the depths for weeks at a time, lived under severe rationing. Space aboard a submarine was precious, every cubic inch had to justify its existence. Food supplies were carefully calculated for survival, not comfort. Fresh provisions spoiled quickly in the humid confines of a submerged vessel. Men subsisted on canned goods, hardtack, preserved meat, and the knowledge that malnutrition and scurvy were ever-present threats on extended patrol. An American escort carrier, by contrast, carried supplies of abundance that would have seemed miraculous to a German submariner. The USS Bogue and her sister ships were built on merchant vessel hulls. They retained the cargo carrying capacity of their original design. This meant space for food, fuel, ammunition, and supplies that appeared virtually unlimited compared to submarine operations. Fresh provisions were regular. The commissary aboard an escort carrier could stock chicken, butter, real meat, coffee, and the thousand small luxuries that separated civilization from mere survival. When the ship headed to port for replenishment, supplies could be loaded in quantities that seemed, from a submariner's perspective, almost obscene in their abundance. This was not merely a matter of comfort. It was a symbol and a reality of the two systems in collision. One system, the German system, was built on the assumption that scarcity was inevitable and that an ideology could compensate for material limitations. The other system, the American system, was built on the principle that material abundance could be harnessed to overwhelm obstacles. When German U-boat commanders were captured and eventually returned home after the war, they spoke not primarily of tactical defeat but of technological obsolescence and material incapacity. They had encountered a nation that could build more ships than Germany could sink, produce more aircraft than Germany could shoot down, and develop new weapons faster than German industry could counter them. The hunters of the Atlantic had become the hunted, and this reversal reveals a fundamental truth about the war that extended far beyond the Battle of the Atlantic. Technology alone did not decide the outcome. Numerical strength alone did not decide the outcome. Rather, it was the integration of technology, strategy, courage, and above all, the mobilization of industrial capacity at a scale that the Axis powers could not match. The U-boat arm did not lose the Battle of the Atlantic because German submariners were inferior sailors or because their boats were inherently poor designs. They lost because they encountered a system that had marshaled the full resources of American productive capacity toward their defeat. The escort carriers represented American ingenuity, the improvisation of warships from merchant hulls, the rapid development of new weapons like the phytotorpedo, the integration of radar technology with aircraft tactics. But they also represented something more fundamental, the expression of American industrial power in its most essential form. These were not elaborate weapons systems requiring years of development. They were, by contrast, relatively simple vessels carrying relatively simple aircraft and relatively new but workable weapons. What made them effective was the speed at which they could be produced and deployed, the quantity in which they could be supplied, and the steady stream of replacement aircraft, torpedoes, and trained pilots that kept them in the fight. By the summer of 1943, the U-boat threat had been decisively broken. U-boats would continue to operate for the remainder of the war, and they would continue to achieve occasional successes. But the strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to the Allies. The convoys would no longer run through waters where they faced determined and coordinated wolf-pack attacks. British supply lines would not be severed. American material would flow across the Atlantic to support the eventual invasion of Europe. And all of this became possible because, in the space of a few weeks in the spring of 1943, the technology and tactics that had seemed invincible were suddenly revealed as vulnerable to a different approach. The psychological transformation this represented cannot be overstated. German submariners, who had been told that they represented the cutting edge of modern warfare, who had been celebrated as supermen of the superior race, suddenly confronted the reality that they had been rendered obsolete by an enemy whose productive capacity they could not hope to match. This was a trauma that struck at the ideological core of Nazism, which had promised German technological and martial superiority. The truth was far more prosaic: the Allies possessed better factories, better access to raw materials, and better ability to translate scientific discoveries into operational weapons. The escort carriers that hunted German submarines across the Atlantic in 1943 and beyond represented something enduring about the nature of modern warfare and the relationship between industrial capacity and military power. They were not the most sophisticated weapons systems ever built, nor the most expensive. They were, rather, pragmatic solutions to urgent problems, merchantmen hastily converted to carry aircraft, piloted by brave and often exhausted young men, equipped with weapons that were operational necessities rather than perfect designs. And yet they proved more decisive than any battleship, more transformative than any strategic concept. They proved that in a war between industrial systems, the system with greater capacity for production, innovation, and adaptation would ultimately prevail. This lesson would echo through the remainder of the war and well beyond it, into the age of industrial democracy's struggle against ideological authoritarianism. When German U-boat survivors were liberated after the war and returned to a defeated homeland, they carried with them the memory of those weeks in 1943 when their world inverted. They had learned, through bitter experience, what American industrial power truly meant. The submarines would never again enjoy the freedom of the Atlantic. The wolves, briefly supreme in their domain, had learned to fear the sky. And in that fear lay the seed of a larger truth, that the side that could produce more, innovate faster, and adapt more readily would inherit the earth, or at least the portion of it worth having. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not with a single dramatic blow, but through the patient accumulation of technological advantage, the relentless production of ever more aircraft and carriers and ships and weapons, and the courage of men willing to fly into danger to defend the convoys and the democracy they represented. It was won because one side possessed something that no amount of ideology or warrior spirit could overcome: the capacity to transform scientific discovery into industrial production faster than an enemy could adapt to the threat. In the end, the Atlantic remained free not because of any single victory, but because American democracy could do what authoritarian systems could not: mobilize the full productive potential of an entire society toward a single objective, sustain it over years of warfare, and continuously innovate even as the enemy sought to counter each new threat. The escort carriers were merely the instruments through which this power was expressed. But they were powerful instruments indeed, and they left upon the waters of the Atlantic the mark of an industrial civilization at full mobilization, a civilization that would emerge from the war as the dominant power of a new age. And somewhere in those depths, where U-boats no longer hunted with impunity, the waters themselves seemed to remember: the age of the wolf pack was over. The age of abundance and industrial might had begun.